Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're exploring something fundamental, often unseen, but incredibly powerful. The role of power, specifically within the narratives that shape how we understand reality.
Indeed. We're going to get into Epistemologies of Power, Foucault, Gramsci, and the dominant narrative. And our framework for this comes from Jelena Simunovic's work, The Cognosystemic Theory of Human Psychosocial Relational Construction, TCCR for short.
Right. So our aim today is to really unpack how power works, how it gets organized, and how it, reproduces itself through the stories we accept, the ideas that become truth. We'll be looking closely at Michel Foucault and Antonio Gramsci, and then seeing how the TCCR brings their insights together around this idea of narrative power. Let's dive in.
Let's start with Foucault. He really turned the traditional idea of power on its head. He argued it's not just this top-down thing, like a king or a government decreeing things.
Not just centralized control, then.
Exactly. Foucault saw it as much more subtle, more pervasive, a diffuse capillary network of relations, as he put it. It permeates everything, our conversations, our bodies, our institutions. Think of it like currents flowing through society, shaping things without a single source.
Okay, that image of power as this widespread network is already a big shift. But then Foucault connects it directly to knowledge, doesn't he? His power-knowledge idea. What does that mean for how we see truth?
That's really the crux of it. He famously said, "There is no knowledge without power, nor power that does not produce knowledge." It doesn't necessarily mean all knowledge is deliberately fake, but that it's never truly neutral.
So what we think we know isn't just discovered, it's produced.
In a way, yes. What a society accepts as fact, as truth, as science, these are often shaped, even produced, by existing power structures. Foucault called these regimes of truth. They basically set the rules for what can be said, what makes sense, what's considered valid.
Could you give an example? How does this power-producing knowledge actually work in practice?
Well, think about his work in Discipline and Punish. He looks at institutions like prisons, or even schools. They don't just control people physically, they actively produce knowledge about them by creating categories. Think normal student versus problem child, or rehabilitated inmate versus deviant. This knowledge, these labels, then justify the control the institution exerts. Normalcy isn't just found, it's defined and enforced through these power-knowledge dynamics.
That's quite profound. Okay, so if power isn't just saying no, but actively shaping things, Foucault identifies specific ways it operates. You mentioned some key concepts.
Yes, exactly. It's productive, not just repressive.
Yeah.
3 key ideas really stand out. First, there's biopolitics. This is about controlling whole populations, not by force, but through managing ideas of what's normal or healthy.
Like public health campaigns setting standards for bodies or behavior.
Precisely. Those standards, those normative discourses, guide how millions think about health, lifestyle, even risk. It's power operating on the level of life itself, managing populations by shaping norms.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second concept?
Second is governmentality. This is power as the management of conduct. It's less about ordering people around and more about creating conditions where people choose to act in certain ways that align with, say, state objectives.
So it's more subtle, like guiding choices.
Right. Think about policies around poverty or education. They might create incentives or pathways that gently steer individuals toward certain behaviors or life choices, often without overt command. It's about fostering self-regulation in line with broader goals.
Okay, so we have population-level control with biopolitics, managing conduct with governmentality. How does it get down to the individual level, shaping who we are? That sounds like subjectivation.
You've got it. Subjectivation is how discourses, ways of thinking and talking about things, literally create ways of being. They make us into subjects of a certain kind.
Can you give an example there?
Sure. Think about medical or psychiatric discourse. The categories healthy, ill, depressed, anxious. They don't just describe a pre-existing condition. They actively shape how individuals understand themselves, their experiences, their possibilities. You become a patient, an anxiety sufferer. These discourses construct our very sense of self.
And how does the TCCR framework use this Foucaultian perspective?
It's fundamental to the TCCR.
Okay.
It takes this view that dominant narratives aren't just stories. They actively structure what we can say, think, and even feel or experience as real. They literally define the boundaries of our psychosocial reality.
Okay, Foucault gives us this picture of power as pervasive, subtle, productive, almost invisible sometimes. But then power often feels like something we agree to, right? How do we get to a point of consensus? This seems like where Antonio Gramsci comes in. How do these ideas connect?
That's a perfect transition, because Gramsci offers a complementary view. While Foucault focused on those micro-networks, Gramsci looked at the bigger picture. How is power maintained, not just through force or subtle discipline, but through cultural consensus?
So winning hearts and minds, essentially.
You could say that. Gramsci argued power sustains itself more through cultural consensus than through direct coercion. It's about how dominant groups get subordinate groups to actively consent to the existing order, often by making it seem natural or inevitable.
And that's his concept of cultural hegemony.
Precisely. Cultural hegemony is achieved when a particular narrative serving the interests of a dominant group becomes so widespread and accepted that it just feels like common sense.
Like it's just the way things are.
Exactly. It makes the ruling group's worldview seem legitimate, natural, even desirable to everyone else. Think about the narrative of individualism or consumerism. In many societies, they often feel like basic truths, not like constructed ideologies that serve particular interests. It's a very subtle but profound form of control because it works through our own acceptance.
But you mentioned Gramsci saw this hegemony as always partial and incomplete. It's not absolute.
No, and that's crucial. It's a constant struggle. Hegemony needs to be actively maintained because there are always competing narratives, always resistance. This dynamic nature opens the door for counter-hegemony, for challenges to the dominant common sense.
So it's a constant push and pull. Who are the main players in this battle for meaning? Gramsci talked about organic intellectuals, right?
Yes. And these aren't necessarily academics. Organic intellectuals are people who emerge from different parts of society, maybe journalists, teachers, activists, artists, religious leaders, even influential online figures. Their role is crucial in articulating, spreading, reinforcing, or sometimes challenging the dominant narratives within their spheres. They shape the cultural conversation.
Okay, so they're embedded within society, shaping ideas. And Gramsci also broadened the idea of the state, didn't he? Beyond just government and police.
He did. He spoke of the expanded state. This includes not just the coercive apparatus, police, military courts, but also the institutions of civil society. Think media outlets, schools, churches, unions, cultural organizations.
And these are important because,
for Gramsci, these civil society institutions are crucial for the production of consensus. They are the primary sites where cultural values are shaped, debated, and disseminated, where hegemony is built and maintained.
How does the TCCR then integrate Gramsci's ideas?
The TCCR really picks up on this idea that hegemonic narratives don't just control, they naturalize power relations. They make inequalities seem normal or unavoidable. So the TCCR proposes we need to analyze how these dominant narratives are built, how they're challenged, and critically, how they can be transformed. It directly links changing narratives to changing society.
All right, so we have Foucault's microphysics of power woven into institutions and knowledge, and Gramsci's macro-level view of power built through cultural consensus and hegemony. How does the TCCR bring these seemingly different views together?
That's the real strength of the TCCR's approach. It synthesizes them. It recognizes that power operates on both these levels simultaneously. You have the subtle disciplinary power Foucault described, working through institutions and shaping individuals, and you have the broader cultural currents of hegemony that Gramsci identified, shaping collective belief.
So it's not an either situation.
Not at all. The TCCR uses both to provide a more complete picture of how power configures our narrative systems, impacting everything from societal structures down to individual thoughts and feelings.
What specific things does this combined view help the TCCR explain?
Well, several key dynamics become clearer. First, how narrative hierarchies get consolidated. Why do certain stories become dominant? The TCCR, using both thinkers, can analyze how, for example, the narrative of meritocracy gets reinforced both through institutional practices, like standardized testing Foucault, and through cultural promotion as common sense, Gramsci, often pushing aside stories about systemic barriers.
Okay, so it explains dominance. What about resistance?
Right. Second, it helps explain how frictions, resistances, and displacements emerge. When the dominant narrative doesn't fit people's lived experiences, you get pushback. The TCCR looks at how subjugated narratives, the stories from the margins, can challenge the hegemonic narratives. Think about social movements bringing previously ignored experiences of discrimination into the mainstream conversation. That's narrative friction, a struggle informed by both micro-level experiences and broader counter-hegemonic efforts. And there's a third point about Memes, cognosystemic memes.
Oh, yes,
cognosystemic memes. Within the TCCR, these are like basic units of cultural information ideas, phrases, symbols, maybe even ways of feeling that spread and replicate. Think of the idea that digital connectivity equals progress.
Like a viral slogan.
Sort of. But the TCCR focuses on how these memes carry power. That specific meme, connectivity equals progress, reinforces certain dominant narratives about technology and globalization, potentially marginalizing other values like community or sustainability. These memes circulate across all levels, from individual attitudes to global policies, and can either reinforce or destabilize the dominant narrative landscape.
This brings us squarely to the idea of the dominant narrative itself as a kind of technology of power. How does the TCCR define that?
It's conceptualized as the story that symbolically structures reality. It organizes not just meaning, but also our emotions and behaviors. Its dominance isn't just political or economic, it's fundamentally semiotic and cultural. It shapes how we perceive everyday life, often without us even noticing.
Like the lens through which we see everything.
Exactly. And crucially, these dominant narratives develop what the TCCR calls narrative inertia.
Meaning they're hard to change.
Very hard. They gain resistance to change through processes of institutionalization and legitimization. They get embedded in laws, in education systems, in media portrayals, in cultural habits. This inertia makes them stable and acts as a powerful, often invisible, mechanism of social control.
Given how powerful and entrenched these narratives are, what does the TCCR suggest we do?
It issues a clear call to action. The TCCR explicitly calls for the analysis and transformation of these narratives. It frames this work not just as an academic exercise, but as a political and ethical act within social work. Understanding narrative power becomes essential for anyone aiming for critical and transformative practice.
Okay, let's talk about those practical implications, especially for fields like social work. How does this understanding change how professionals might intervene?
It's transformative for practice. First, it equips professionals to identify oppressive or silenced narratives. They can start to see how dominant stories might be actively harming or marginalizing the people they work with, for instance. Narratives that pathologize poverty rather than seeing systemic causes, or narratives that erase the history and perspectives of minority communities. So, looking beyond the individual case to the surrounding narrative environment.
Precisely.
Second, it encourages practitioners to consciously create spaces for alternative stories. This means helping individuals and communities articulate and value their own experiences, fostering narratives that build agency, dignity, and promote social justice. It's about co-creating stories of resilience, strength, and possibility that counter the dominant, often disempowering ones.
And the ultimate aim?
Third, it positions professionals to act as agents of symbolic and structural transformation. By engaging in what the TCCR terms narrative disputes, they can actively promote counter-narratives or stories of resistance, helping to challenge and shift the hegemonic ones. This could be anything from supporting community storytelling projects to advocating for policy changes based on marginalized perspectives. It connects narrative work directly to social change.
So, to bring it all together, what the TCCR suggests, drawing on Foucault and Gramsci, is that in the psychosocial realm, pretty much every interaction, every intervention, is in some way a narrative dispute. Understanding these epistemologies of power isn't just intellectual curiosity.
Absolutely not. It's fundamental. It's the bedrock for developing a truly critical social work practice, one that aims not just to help people cope within existing structures, but to actually empower them to challenge and transform those structures by changing the stories that uphold them.
Which leaves us, and you, the listener, with a really crucial thought to consider. If our realities are so profoundly shaped by these dominant, often common sense narratives,
then what unexamined truths might you be accepting without question? What parts of your common sense might actually be constructs of power? And perhaps most importantly, what new possibilities could open up for you and for your community if you started to consciously question and maybe even rewrite some of those stories?